It had been a long week for Emma. Her work in the city had drained her energy, and her social life was practically non-existent. That's when she decided to try something new. She downloaded Tinder. After scrolling through dozens of profiles, she found Luke. His smile was warm, and his eyes seemed kind. They had mutual interests, hiking, indie films, and, oddly enough, an obsession with obscure conspiracy theories. Emma was intrigued and swiped right. The conversation started slowly but soon picked up. Luke was charming, and they shared laughs over quirky facts and stories from their lives. After a few days of chatting, Luke suggested they meet in person. He was an hour away, but that didn't seem like too much of a stretch. They agreed on a cozy cafe on the outskirts of town for their first date. Emma was nervous, but the excitement of meeting someone new made her push aside the anxiety. The day of the date, Emma dressed carefully, choosing a flowy dress and a light cardigan, trying to keep it casual but flattering. She told her friend Rachel about the date, and as they chatted, Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Just be careful, okay? You don't know this guy. People can be weird." Emma rolled her eyes, brushing off the comment. She had told Luke her full name, where she worked, and what her family was like. She didn't think it was anything out of the ordinary, just basic small talk. But Rachel's warning gnawed at her, just a little. When Emma arrived at the cafe, she spotted Luke immediately. He was sitting at a small corner table, looking exactly like his profile picture, tall, handsome, with a gentle smile. He stood up to greet her, and as they hugged, Emma could feel the heat of his body, and something about it sent a shiver down her spine. She attributed it to first-date nerves and quickly dismissed it. They sat down, and the conversation flowed easily. He asked about her day, her family, her hobbies. He seemed genuinely interested, attentive. But as time went on, Emma noticed subtle oddities in his behavior. He asked her an inordinate number of questions about her life, things that seemed too specific. Not just about her childhood or job, but about things she'd only mentioned in passing. "How was that trip you took last summer to the mountains with your friends? The one you said you loved but didn't quite finish?" Emma was caught off guard. "You remember that?" "Yeah, it was a great trip, but we ran out of time because of work." Luke's smile remained, but his eyes seemed a little too intent. "You know, I did some research on that trail. It's actually a pretty dangerous place if you're not careful. I'm sure your friends warned you." Yeah. We knew about it. We were fine." Emma laughed nervously, but she could feel the discomfort building. He was too focused on the details. Luke noticed her unease and quickly shifted the topic. "Sorry, I get carried away. I just like to learn about the places I want to visit. I do a lot of research. Just trying to keep people safe, you know." Emma forced a smile, but inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The conversation took another strange turn when Luke asked her about her house. "So, do you live alone, or?" he asked, almost too casually. Emma hesitated, unsure how to respond. It wasn't unusual for someone to ask if she had roommates or lived by herself, but the way Luke phrased the question made her uneasy. "I live alone," she said slowly, trying to keep her tone neutral. He smiled, but his eyes didn't match his expression. "That's interesting. I find it's always better that way. No one to distract you, no one to watch your every move." He leaned in slightly. "I bet you like your privacy, huh?" Emma laughed awkwardly, but inside, a dark seed of doubt planted itself in her mind. It was just the way he said it, too smooth, too certain. She felt the weight of his gaze on her skin, like he was peeling back layers she didn't want to expose. The conversation continued, but now Emma found it harder to focus. Every word Luke spoke seemed calculated, and the way he stared at her, almost like he was memorizing every detail, made her feel like a specimen in a jar. "How about we go for a walk? Luke suggested, breaking her thoughts. There's a park nearby. It's really peaceful this time of night. Emma wasn't sure. It was already getting dark, and she had just met this guy. But she didn't want to be rude, so she agreed, figuring it might help her relax and shake off the weird tension. They left the cafe and walked toward the park. The area was quiet, almost too quiet. The streetlights flickered weakly above them, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. Luke led the way, and Emma followed, feeling a strange discomfort creep over her with every step. The park seemed abandoned, a patch of overgrown grass surrounded by dense trees. As they reached a bench near a small pond, Luke sat down, gesturing for Emma to join him. She hesitated but eventually sat down beside him. "Isn't it nice?" Luke asked. His voice was soft, almost too soft. "Just the two of us, away from everything." Emma nodded, but her heart was starting to race. The atmosphere was suffocating, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The park was eerily quiet, with no other people in sight. Suddenly, Luke turned to her. His eyes were intense, unnervingly so. "I've been thinking about something," he said slowly. "Okay." Emma replied, her voice tight. "You seem like someone who values privacy," Luke continued, his voice low and controlled. "You don't mind being alone. But I wonder, would you ever share that privacy with someone else? With someone who knows everything about you?" Emma felt a cold wave wash over her. "What do you mean?" Luke leaned closer, his breath now just inches from her ear. "I've been watching you, Emma. For a while now." Her blood ran cold. "What? What are you talking about?" Luke smiled, but there was no warmth in it. It was cold, predatory. "I know where you live, Emma. I know about your work, your hobbies, everything. I've made sure of it." Her stomach churned. Panic surged through her body as she realized the horrifying truth: this date wasn't just a chance encounter. It was planned. Luke wasn't just some guy she met online. He had stalked her, followed her, and now, he was playing some twisted game. She stood up quickly, her mind screaming for her to run, but Luke grabbed her wrist with surprising force, pulling her back toward him. "Where are you going?" he whispered, his voice thick with amusement. "You can't leave yet. We've only just started getting to know each other." Emma's pulse hammered in her throat as she tried to break free, but his grip was ironclad. She yanked her arm, her mind racing for a way out. She didn't know how far she could run, but she knew she had to try. In a burst of panic, Emma kicked Luke in the shin with all the strength she had. He grunted, letting go of her wrist just long enough for her to break free. Without thinking, she ran, faster than she ever had in her life, through the park, back toward the streets. She didn't stop to look behind her. The only sound she could hear was the thudding of her own heartbeat in her ears, and the terrified, ragged breaths she took as she sprinted through the streets, looking for anyone, any place, that could offer safety. When she finally reached a well-lit corner, gasping for breath, she whipped around, praying to see a police car, a person, anything. But there was no sign of Luke. The world felt like it was closing in on her, and every shadow, every rustling leaf felt like it might be him. She stumbled back to her apartment, locked the door, and barricaded herself inside. But she couldn't escape the feeling that she was being watched. That somewhere, in the dark, Luke was still waiting. This terrifying Tinder date left Emma with more questions than answers. Was Luke still out there, watching her every move? The horror didn't end when she locked the door. It had only just begun. Emma spent the next few days in a fog of anxiety, unable to shake the feeling that someone was watching her every move. The moment she'd stepped into her apartment and locked the door, she'd told herself she was safe. But deep down, she knew better. Luke had been too calm, too prepared. He hadn't just stumbled upon her by accident. He'd been following her for weeks, maybe longer. The following morning, after an uncomfortable night of fitful sleep, Emma woke up to a notification on her phone. It was a text from an unknown number. She hesitated for a moment, but then opened it. "You looked beautiful last night, Emma. I really enjoyed our time together. I'm glad you finally saw the truth. Don't worry, I'll be seeing you again soon." Her stomach dropped. A chill spread through her body, and she felt her skin go clammy. She stared at the message, unable to comprehend what she was reading. The message had no name, no hint of who sent it, but there was something familiar about the words. It felt personal. Too personal. She stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity, then quickly turned off her phone and threw it onto her bed. She couldn't breathe. Her entire body shook as she stood up, pacing the room, trying to make sense of the situation. How did Luke get her number? He'd never asked for it during the date. He wasn't even supposed to know where she lived, or did he? Panic clawed at her throat, and her thoughts spiraled. Suddenly, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was an image, an old photo. She swallowed hard as she opened it. It was a photo of her apartment building. And there, in the corner of the frame, was Luke. Standing outside, just under a streetlight, watching her window. Her breath caught in her throat. She dropped the phone to the floor as her vision blurred. She wanted to scream, to run, but every part of her body felt paralyzed. How long had he been there? Had he been watching her all night? Emma snatched up her phone again, trying to dial 911, but before she could press the call button, another text popped up. "I've been watching you for weeks, Emma. I know everything about you. I know when you're awake, when you sleep, when you go out, when you come back. You're mine now. I'll be seeing you again soon, darling." She froze. The world around her began to collapse, the walls closing in as the weight of the words sunk into her chest. Luke knew everything. He knew her routine. She was a prisoner in her own home, unable to escape this suffocating nightmare. Emma's hands were shaking so violently that she dropped her phone again. She couldn't think. She couldn't even breathe. But then, the sound. A low creak. It came from the window. Emma whipped her head around, her heart leaping into her throat. She rushed to the window and yanked the curtains open. Nothing. The street was empty, the early morning light casting long shadows across the concrete. She saw no movement, no sign of anyone, but the hair on the back of her neck stood on end. It was impossible for him to be there. Wasn't it? She stepped back, her mind reeling. It was then that she noticed something. On the ground beneath her window, just below the ledge, was a small white envelope. She hadn't heard anyone approach. It had to be there when she'd looked out earlier, but she hadn't seen it. Had she? She felt like a puppet, strings pulled tight by fear, as she approached the envelope cautiously. She kneeled down and hesitated for a moment, a cold sweat forming on her brow. What could it be? She already knew the answer, but she had to see it for herself. With trembling hands, she picked up the envelope. It had no markings, no address, nothing to identify who had left it. She opened it slowly, her stomach churning with dread. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was disturbingly neat, almost too perfect. "You thought you could escape. But now, you'll truly understand what it means to be mine." The words were followed by a crude drawing of her. It was a distorted version of her face, with jagged lines outlining her features, as if someone had sketched her from memory. But the most disturbing part wasn't the drawing, it was the detail. Her eyes were wide open in the image, but there was something else. Something darker. Her lips were twisted in a grotesque, unnatural smile, and the eyes were hollow, like black voids. And at the bottom of the page, there was one more chilling line. "I'm inside." Emma's blood ran cold. Her hands trembled as she read the note over and over again. She forced herself to look around her apartment, scanning the rooms, her heartbeat thundering in her chest. Her eyes locked onto the door. It was closed. She hadn't left it open. But what if he was already here? With a burst of adrenaline, she ran to the door and threw it open. She rushed into the hallway, desperate to find anyone, any sign of life, but there was nothing. The building was eerily silent. The walls seemed to press in on her as she sprinted down the narrow hallway to the stairwell. The air was thick, heavy with a sense of impending doom. Emma's only thought was to get out. She had to leave. But the elevator was down, and the stairs felt like an eternity. She could hear the sound of her footsteps echoing, bouncing off the walls, but all the while, there was something else. A whisper. A soft, almost imperceptible sound that made her skin crawl. A voice. She stopped dead in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. It was coming from below. From the basement. A door creaked open. The voice was getting clearer now, louder. "Come down, Emma. Come see me. We need to talk." It was Luke's voice. But it wasn't just his voice. It was different. Twisted. There was something wrong about it, as though the words were coated in darkness, like the sound of fingernails scraping across a blackboard. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to run, but Emma's legs felt like they were made of stone. She backed away, slowly, trying not to make a sound. But her heart was pounding so loudly that she feared it would give her away. Then, she heard it. The soft tap of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the stairwell behind her. A low chuckle followed, one that made her blood run cold. She turned. And there he was. Luke. Standing at the top of the stairs. His smile was wide and twisted, his eyes hollow and dark. He had changed. His face looked even more gaunt, more twisted than she remembered. His clothes were ragged, his hands trembling, and there was something unnatural about the way he moved. He stepped forward slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the fear radiating from her. "I told you I'd be seeing you again," Luke whispered, his voice like a snake's hiss. Emma turned and bolted toward the exit. She ran as fast as she could, but the darkness of the building seemed to close in on her, suffocating her. She could hear Luke's footsteps behind her, closer now, but there was something else too, a low, growling noise, as if something more was following him. As she reached the front door, her hand trembling, she yanked it open, only to find the hallway filled with shadows. Luke's voice came from behind her again. "You're never going to escape, Emma. You're mine now."